3 men ended a dynasty. One shattered a prince with a warhammer. One opened the gates of a city to an army that claimed to be its friend. And one drove a sword into the back of the king he had sworn to protect. But none of those men began the war. That honor belonged to a prince who disappeared, a young woman who never lived to tell her side of the story, and a king who believed fire could settle any argument. At the end of the rebellion, Eddard Stark rode into the Red Mountains of Dorne with 6 companions. He was searching for his sister, Lyanna. Instead, he found 3 of the greatest knights in the 7 kingdoms standing before a lonely tower. The war was over. Their prince was dead. Their king was dead. The capital had fallen. Yet the knights would not move. 7 men drew steel against 3. When the fighting ended, only Ned Stark and Howland Reed remained alive.
Lyanna Stark was dying when Ned found her, surrounded not by chains, but by blood, silence, and the blue roses Robert had never understood. She made her brother a promise. Whatever had happened between her and Rhaegar, the child beside her could not be allowed to pay for it. Outside that room, Robert Baratheon had won the throne. Inside it, Ned learned that victory had solved almost nothing. The history written afterward would be cleaner. A stolen woman, a murdered family, a heroic rebellion, and a dragon prince defeated by the man she loved. Songs reduced the war to Robert and Rhaegar, 2 warriors fighting over Lyanna. It was powerful, memorable, and dangerously incomplete, because beautiful stories hide machinery. Behind this one stood old alliances, wounded pride, prophecy, captivity, and decisions made years before anyone raised a banner. To understand the rebellion, we have to follow 5 lives: Aerys, Tywin, Rhaegar, Lyanna, and the young knight who would one day kill his king. The story does not begin when Robert's hammer struck rubies into a river. It does not begin when Rhaegar placed blue roses in Lyanna Stark's lap. It begins years earlier, when the man remembered as the Mad King was still young, handsome, and full of impossible hope.
For nearly 300 years, House Targaryen ruled Westeros, first through living dragons, and later through the memory of what those dragons had done. Aegon conquered kingdoms with fire. But the last Targaryen dragon died more than a century before Aerys inherited the crown. What remained were bones, banners, silver hair, and a throne forged from the swords of defeated kings. Memory still had power. Lords obeyed the dragon banner because their families remembered what resistance had once cost. But memory is not the same as strength. Every generation without dragons made the old threat a little less immediate. The Iron Throne looked permanent. Beneath it, the foundations of Targaryen rule were already beginning to crack. The dynasty had survived civil war, plague, rebellion, weak kings, cruel kings, and the extinction of the creatures that made its conquest possible. Yet the great houses were becoming richer, more independent, and more connected to one another than the crown understood. Into that fragile inheritance stepped Aerys Targaryen, 18 years old, charming, restless, and eager to become a legend. He was not yet the monster history remembers. That is precisely what makes the beginning of his reign matter. Aerys wanted to conquer the Stepstones and turn the narrow sea into a road controlled by the throne. Then he imagined a new white city on the Blackwater, grander and more beautiful than King's Landing itself. He spoke of humbling Braavos, the wealthiest free city in the world, though he possessed neither the fleet nor the plan to do it. He proposed building a second wall farther north, as if one impossible monument were merely an invitation to build another. He dreamed of cutting canals through Dorne and making the desert bloom beneath his name. Each vision arrived like revelation. Each disappeared when celebration ended, and the cost, labor, and years of work finally came into view. Aerys loved the announcement, the silence before he spoke, the astonishment afterward, the brief moment when everyone saw the future exactly as he described it. What he did not love was governing, the ledgers, compromises, delays, and ordinary decisions from which real achievements are built. Fortunately, one of his oldest companions understood that work better than almost anyone alive, Tywin Lannister. Aerys, Tywin, and Stephen Baratheon had fought together in the War of the Nine Penny Kings. Once they had genuinely been friends. Aerys understood spectacle. Tywin understood consequence. One could make a court believe. The other could make a kingdom function. People enjoyed the king's charm, but when Tywin entered a room, even powerful men measured their words. Aerys announced policies in sunlight. Tywin spent the night discovering what they would cost and how they could actually be carried out. To Tywin, a kingdom was a living ledger of roads, debts, harvests, marriages, punishments, and armies that all had to balance. When Aerys became king, he named his brilliant young friend Hand. For a time, the choice seemed inspired. The dragon wore the crown. The lion handled the government. Together, they gave Westeros years of order and prosperity. Debts were reduced. Roads became safer. Trade recovered. The machinery of the realm began to work with cold efficiency. Tywin's order was never gentle. He believed fear was useful. Punishment should be remembered, and disorder should become too expensive to repeat. Aerys received the praise owed to a king, but more and more, the realm understood whose mind was producing the results. Soon, a dangerous sentence traveled through the Red Keep. Aerys sat the throne, but Tywin Lannister ruled the Seven Kingdoms. At first, Aerys answered that humiliation with jokes, small public cuts designed to remind the court which of the two men wore the crown. Then he began rejecting Tywin's advice simply because it was Tywin's, even when he knew the advice was sound. He made improper remarks about Joanna Lannister, Tywin's wife, turning private resentment into an insult no proud husband could forget. Every success made Tywin more valuable to the realm and more threatening to the king. Competence itself had become suspicious. The friendship did not break at once. It cracked slowly beneath smiles, ceremonies, and years of words neither man could take back. The royal family was breaking as well. Aerys and his sister wife, Queen Rhaella, lived inside a marriage arranged without love. Their grandfather had ordered the union after a woods witch foretold that the promised prince would descend from their bloodline. Their first surviving child, Rhaegar, was born at Summerhall while fire consumed the palace and killed much of his family. After Rhaegar came years of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants who did not survive. Every empty cradle deepened the grief inside the royal chambers. Aerys did not meet grief with tenderness. He searched for poisoners, lovers, traitors, and anyone he could blame.
Servants were questioned. Wet nurses were accused. Rhaella's movements were watched as though surveillance could force life to obey the king. The queen could not escape the marriage. The court looked away, and the distance between them became another locked door inside the Red Keep. Tywin still tried to bind the two houses together. He proposed that his daughter Cersei marry Crown Prince Rhaegar. Cersei had grown up dreaming of that match, a golden lion beside a silver prince standing at the center of the world. Politically, it was formidable. Lannister wealth would support the throne, and Tywin's loyalty would become family loyalty. Aerys refused him before the court, not because the alliance was weak, but because humiliating Tywin had become more important than strengthening the crown. A king, he said, did not marry his heir to a servant's daughter. The words were meant to wound, and they did. Rhaegar was married instead to Aelia Martell of Dorne, joining dragon and son while leaving the lion outside the royal family. Tywin remained hand. He smiled when ceremony required it, but beneath that obedience, something between the two men had ended. The next disaster began in a declining port called Duskendale, where another proud lord had begun to resent the shadow of King's Landing. Duskendale had once been one of Blackwater Bay's great ports. Then the capital grew, trade moved west, and the old harbor began to fade. Its lord, Dennis Darklyn, asked the crown for a new charter that would restore privileges, income, and control to his town. Tywin refused. Dennis answered by withholding royal taxes, transforming a commercial dispute into open defiance. Then Dennis appealed to the one weakness he understood perfectly, Aerys's need to prove he could succeed without his hand. He invited the king to Duskendale. Tywin saw the danger and urged Aerys not to enter the town without overwhelming force. That warning guaranteed the opposite. Aerys rode out with a small escort, Sir Gawain Gaunt was killed, and the king was taken alive. His crown, cloak, and jewels were removed. In a few violent minutes, the blood of the dragon became an ordinary captive. Aerys was locked inside the Dun fort, beyond the reach of his court, his guards, and every symbol that had once protected him. Tywin arrived with an army and surrounded Duskendale. But Dennis threatened to kill the king the moment an assault began. In the cell, Aerys discovered that sacred blood bruised like any other. Hunger felt the same, and royal commands meant nothing behind a locked door. Outside, Tywin waited. He neither withdrew nor rushed forward, and every day of patience sharpened the question inside the town. Darklyn envoys asked for terms. Tywin offered no rescue disguised as generosity, and no reward for taking a king hostage. He prepared to storm the walls, knowing Aerys might die. According to some accounts, he was ready to crown Rhaegar if that happened. That possibility mattered because the realm already had a calmer, younger, and more promising king waiting in the prince. Inside the darkness, possibility became certainty. Aerys convinced himself that Tywin and Rhaegar wanted him left there to die. 6 months passed, long enough for fear to become memory, memory to become evidence, and suspicion to become the only explanation he trusted. Then, Sir Barristan Selmy offered a plan no commander could reasonably promise. He would enter the town alone and bring the king out. Disguised as a hooded beggar, Barristan slipped through Duskendale, entered the Dun fort, and reached Aerys before the final assault began. He killed the guards who blocked him, carried the weakened king to safety, and turned an impossible rescue into the legend of Barristan the Bold. Once free, Aerys answered humiliation with extermination. House Darkland was destroyed, and nearly every member of House Hollard was condemned with it. Only young Dontos Hollard survived, spared because Barristan begged mercy as payment for the life he had just saved. Lady Sarala suffered the king's most deliberate vengeance. Her punishment was made public, prolonged, and meant to erase any illusion that Aerys had been helpless. But cruelty could not erase the cell. Aerys washed, dressed, and wore his crown again, while the prison remained inside him. He withdrew into the Red Keep until the palace became another fortress and the king inside it another prisoner. No blade was permitted near him. He refused to let anyone cut his hair or nails because even a barber now looked like an assassin. The handsome young king vanished beneath tangled silver hair, long cracked nails, hollow cheeks, and eyes that searched every face for betrayal. Friends were replaced by informers. Advice became conspiracy. Every closed door suggested a secret meeting, and every whisper seemed to contain his name. He found comfort in wildfire, green flame that did not argue, flatter, hesitate, or betray. When he wanted judgment, he called for pyromancers. Duskendale did not create every darkness in Aerys. Tension, but captivity taught him a doctrine he would never abandon. Fear was safer than trust.
From then on, every disagreement could be interpreted as a plot, every successful lord as a rival, every act of mercy as weakness. And the man he feared most was still Tywin Lannister. The final break came through Tywin's son. Jaime Lannister was a brilliant young swordsman, barely 15, and the heir to Casterly Rock. He wanted glory, and for reasons of his own, a life near the Coral Court. Aerys named him to the Kingsguard. To Jaime, the White Cloak looked like the highest honor in the realm. To Tywin, it was theft. A Kingsguard knight could hold no lands, father no lawful heirs, and inherit no seat. With a single appointment, Aerys had taken Tywin's chosen successor away, and left Casterly Rock to pass, in time, to the son Tywin despised, Tyrion. Tywin resigned as Hand of the King and returned west. For almost 2 decades, he had held the realm together. Now, the Mad King had finally succeeded in proving that he did not need him. The cost of that victory would arrive at the gates of King's Landing with 12,000 soldiers. But first, another young man was about to make a choice that no army could reverse.
Prince Rhaegar Targaryen was born in fire. His first cry came at Summerhall, while the Targaryen summer palace burned round his family. King Aegon V, Prince Duncan, and many others died in a mysterious attempt that may have been intended to bring dragons back into the world. Rhaegar grew up beneath the weight of that tragedy. Those who knew him remembered a solemn, intelligent boy, more comfortable with scrolls and songs than swords. Then, one day, he read something that changed him. No one knows exactly what was written on that page, but after reading it, Rhaegar decided that he had to become a warrior. So he did. He trained until the bookish prince became one of the finest knights in the 7 kingdoms. He was handsome, courteous, musically gifted, and touched by a sadness people found irresistible. Where Aerys demanded admiration, Rhaegar attracted it. That made him the kingdom's hope and his father's greatest threat.
Rhaegar was obsessed with prophecy. At first, he seems to have believed that he himself might be the promised prince destined to stand against a coming darkness. Later, he placed that burden on his infant son, Aegon. In a vision witnessed by Daenerys years afterward, Rhaegar spoke of a song of ice and fire and insisted that the dragon must have 3 heads. This belief is essential to understanding him. Without it, Rhaegar can look like a romantic hero who made one reckless choice for love. With it, he becomes something more dangerous, a decent, gifted man who may have believed the future gave him permission to destroy the present. His wife, Elia Martell, had given him 2 children, Rhaenys and Aegon. The births left her physically fragile, and another pregnancy was believed to threaten her life. Rhaegar had 2 children. Prophecy, as he understood it, demanded 3. Did he decide that Lyanna Stark would provide the missing child? Did he believe the blood of the dragon joined to the blood of the old gods would fulfill the song of ice and fire? Did love come first and prophecy afterward? Or did a prophecy become the language in which he justified desire? The books do not answer. That uncertainty is not a flaw in the story. It is the heart of it. History gives us Rhaegar through the memories of people who loved him, hated him, envied him, or barely knew him. To Robert, he was a monster. To Barristan, he was the king Westeros should have had. To Cersei, he was the beautiful life she had been denied. To Jon Connington, he was the lost center of the world. And to Lyanna, she never gets to speak. Before their disappearance, all we truly know is that they met during the greatest tournament Westeros had seen in generations, a celebration held in the brief warmth remembered as the year of the false spring. Every great house came to Harrenhal. So did every secret that would tear the realm apart. Harrenhal was a monument to the arrogance of kings, the largest castle in Westeros, half ruined by dragonfire, its towers twisted like black candles. In 281, Lord Walter Went announced a tournament magnificent enough to make that cursed place feel alive again. The prizes were enormous. The guest list included nearly every lord whose decisions could shape the realm. That raised a question. Who was really paying for it? Some believed Prince Rhaegar secretly financed the tournament. Under this theory, Harrenhal was meant to be more than games. It was a cover for a meeting of the great lords, perhaps even the beginning of a council that would remove Aerys and place Rhaegar in power. It is a compelling theory, but it remains a theory. What is certain is that Aerys heard rumors of a plot. His master of whisperers, Varys, encouraged his suspicion. For the first time since Duskendale, the king left the Red Keep and appeared before the realm. The sight shocked the court. The young, brilliant king of memory was gone. In his place sat a gaunt figure with tangled hair and claw-like nails, watching every cheer for his son as if it were a vote for his own execution. Around him, the future rebellion was still smiling. Robert Baratheon was young, enormous, and already famous for his appetite, for food, wine, laughter, women, and battle. Eddard Stark, quieter and less comfortable in crowds, had come south with his siblings. Brandon was the wild heir of Winterfell, bold enough to act before others had finished thinking. Benjen was still a boy, and Lyanna was fierce, proud, and an exceptional rider. She was also promised to Robert. Robert loved the idea of her. Lyanna was less certain about the man. She knew he already had a child by another woman and doubted marriage would change his nature. Ned defended his friend by saying Robert loved her. Lyanna's answer, in memory, cut through the romance. Love could not change what a man was.
That judgment would become painfully accurate. But at Harrenhal, it was still only the private fear of a young woman expected to marry for alliance. The tournament lasted 10 days. There were feasts, songs, archery, horse races, axe throwing, a great melee, and days of jousting. Rhaegar sang so beautifully at the opening feast that Lyanna cried, then poured wine over Benjen when he mocked her for it. Another guest arrived with no great banner and little protection. Howland Reed, a young crannogman from the Neck. 3 squires attacked and humiliated him. Lyanna found him, drove the attackers away, tended his wounds, and brought him among the Starks. The next day, a mystery knight entered the lists. The knight was small, wore mismatched armor, and carried a shield painted with a laughing weirwood tree. One by one, the mystery rider defeated the knights whose squires had attacked Howland. Instead of demanding gold for the return of their horses and armor, the victor demanded that the knights teach their squires honor. The crowd loved it. Aerys did not. He declared the unknown knight an enemy and ordered the identity beneath the helm uncovered. Rhaegar joined the search. The knight vanished, leaving only the painted shield behind. To this day, the Knight of the Laughing Tree has never been officially identified. The most famous theory is that the rider was Lyanna herself. She had the courage, the horsemanship, the motive, and the size. If that theory is true, Rhaegar may have discovered her secret when he searched for the Mystery Knight. Maybe that was the beginning. Maybe it was only one more story people tell because the truth died in Dorne. On the final day, Rhaegar seemed unstoppable. He defeated great knights, including Arthur Dayne and Barristan Selmy, and won the right to maim the Queen of Love and Beauty. Everyone expected him to honor his wife, Elia. Rhaegar rode past her. He stopped before Lyanna Stark and placed a crown of blue winter roses in her lap. Thousands of people watched. Elia watched. Robert watched. Lyanna's brothers watched. The king watched. No declaration followed. No explanation. Only blue roses resting against gray Stark wool. Years later, Ned would remember it as the instant every smile disappeared. That image survives because it contains the entire tragedy in miniature. Rhaegar may have believed he was honoring destiny. Lyanna may have understood something no one else did. Elia may have been humiliated, resigned, furious, or afraid. Robert may have laughed in the moment and nurtured the insult later. Aterys may have seen fresh evidence that his son was building a kingdom of admirers. We do not know. What we know is what came next. Winter returned. The false spring ended. Snow fell again. And less than a year after Harrenhal, Prince Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark disappeared. The official story was simple. Rhaegar abducted Lyanna. It spread because simple stories travel faster than uncertain ones. A married prince had taken the daughter of Winterfell, a girl promised to another lord. Whether she went willingly, resisted, or changed her mind later, no witness has given the realm a reliable account. The published novels preserve that uncertainty. The television adaptation gives a clearer answer and presents Rhaegar and Lyanna as lovers who married in secret. For now, however, stay inside the history as Westeros experienced it. To the Starks, Lyanna had vanished. To Robert, she had been stolen. And the man accused of taking her was nowhere to be found. Brandon Stark was riding toward Riverrun to marry Catelyn Tully when the news reached him. Brandon had never been a man built for patience. He turned south with a small group of companions and rode straight to King's Landing. Outside the Red Keep, he shouted for Rhaegar to come out and die.
Rhaegar was not there. Aerys was.
The king arrested Brandon and his companions for plotting the murder of the crown prince. Then he summoned their fathers to answer for them. It was the perfect trap. Outrage had delivered the heirs, and royal authority would now bring the lords themselves. Rhaegar Stark came south, expecting law. He demanded trial by combat, an ancient rite by which the gods were asked to judge the truth through battle. Aerys agreed. Then the king named fire as the champion of House Targaryen. Rhaegar was suspended above a blaze in the throne room, sealed inside his armor. Brandon was placed in a strangling device with a sword lying just beyond his reach. Every time he lunged forward, the cord around his neck tightened. The father burned while the son strangled himself trying to save him. Other highborn prisoners and the fathers summoned to defend them were executed as well. In one afternoon, Aerys destroyed heirs and alliances belonging to some of the most powerful families in the realm. This is the true ignition point of Robert's rebellion. Not a tournament, not a flower crown, not even Lyanna's disappearance. The war began when the king turned law into theater and demanded that innocent men participate in their own murder. Even then, Aerys was not finished. Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon were still in the Vale, where Lord Jon Arryn had raised them like sons. Aerys sent a command to the Eyrie: deliver their heads. Jon Arryn had lost his nephew and heir, Elbert, among the men murdered by the king. Now he was ordered to kill the two young lords under his protection without trial and without cause. He had a choice between obedience and honor. Arryn called his banners. In that moment, 4 generations of Targaryen decline became a civil war. The Vale rose first. Ned had to reach the north. Robert had to secure the Stormlands. Their enemies held ports, roads, and castles between them and the armies they were expected to command. They were not yet conquerors. They were fugitives with famous names. Jon Arryn's rebellion did not unite the Vale automatically. Several of his own lords remained loyal to the Iron Throne, and Mark Grafton controlled Gulltown, the port Robert needed to reach Storm's End. So the first blood of the rebellion was spilled not at the Trident, but in the streets and beneath the walls of Gulltown. Robert fought in the assault and killed Mark Grafton himself. It established the pattern that would make men follow him. Robert did not direct courage from the rear. He was huge, fast, and terrifyingly strong, and he placed his own body wherever the fighting was worst. Ned took another route. He crossed the mountains toward the Fingers and found passage across the Bight, struggling north through weather, danger, and uncertain loyalties. When he finally reached Winterfell, he entered it as a second son and emerged as Lord of the North. His father and brother were dead. His sister was missing. A marriage and a lordship meant for Brandon had fallen onto him in a matter of weeks. Ned called the banners. Robert sailed to the Stormlands and discovered that 3 of his own bannermen, Lords Grandison, Cafferin, and Fell, intended to join their forces against him at Summerhall. He refused to let them unite. Using information from inside their camp, Robert struck each army separately. 3 battles were fought in a single day. Lord Fell died. The others were captured. Many rulers know how to defeat enemies. Robert's rare gift was knowing how to recruit them. He treated the captured lords with respect, spoke to them as men of value, and made yesterday's opponents feel that they had a place in tomorrow's victory. Before long, men who had marched against him were drinking beside him and fighting under his banner. That charisma explains why the rebellion came to carry Robert's name, even though Jon Arryn raised the first banners and Ned had suffered the greatest family loss. Robert turned war into fellowship. He remembered names, forgave quickly when forgiveness was useful, and made soldiers believe the feast after the battle would be legendary. But charisma did not make him invincible. Robert left Stannis, his grim younger brother, to hold Storm's End and marched west. Near Ashford, his army met the Royalist vanguard commanded by Randyll Tarly, one of the hardest soldiers in the Reach. Tarly struck before the full Tyrell host arrived and defeated Robert's forces. The battle was not the total destruction later boasting sometimes made it sound like, but Robert was forced away. Mace Tyrell claimed the honor of victory and turned the enormous strength of the Reach towards Storm's End. The war had now created two different tests for House Baratheon. Robert would face movement, pursuit, and open battle. Stannis would face a locked gate and an empty larder. Outside Storm's End, the Tyrell army feasted beneath green and gold banners. The red wine fleet sealed the sea. Inside, Stannis rationed food among a shrinking garrison and his young brother Renly. Robert could not save them. First, he had to survive. The Mad King had replaced another hand and sent Rhaegar's friend, Jon Connington, to crush the rebellion. Connington was young, proud, capable, and desperate to prove himself worthy of the prince he loved. He pursued Robert north until the rebel leader, wounded and separated from his forces, disappeared into a small Riverlands town called Stoney Sept. Connington surrounded it and ordered his men to search every house. Stoney Sept was not a fortress. It had no walls strong enough to stop a royal army, and no lord powerful enough to defy the hand of the king. But it had people. The townsfolk moved Robert from hiding place to hiding place, while Connington's soldiers tore through homes, shops, cellars, and septs. Rewards were offered. Threats followed. Hostages were displayed in cages. Still, no one betrayed him. Robert finally hid in a brothel called the Peach. The detail sounds like a singer's joke invented for the lustiest lord in Westeros. It is also true. Connington faced a terrible choice. He could burn the town and deny Robert every hiding place. Years later, haunted by defeat, he would believe that Tywin Lannister would have done exactly that. But Connington was not Tywin. He wanted to kill Robert, not become infamous for slaughtering an entire town. That hesitation saved the rebellion. Ned Stark and Jon Arryn had joined their forces with Hoster Tully of Riverrun. Their army reached Stoney Sept while the search was still underway. Battle erupted in alleys, on rooftops, and between crowded buildings. Septons rang the town bells to warn everyone to take shelter. Robert heard them from the Peach. He came out armed and joined the fighting. The man Connington had hunted house by house suddenly appeared in the streets, turning a desperate rescue into a rebel victory. Connington fought fiercely. He wounded Hoster Tully and killed Denys Arryn, another of Jon's kinsmen. But the royal army was caught inside hostile streets, with rebel forces pressing in. Connington withdrew rather than let his command be destroyed. The sound of the bells followed him into exile. Aerys stripped him of rank, lands, and title. Another hand had failed. Another possible ally had been converted into an enemy by a king who understood only punishment. For the rebels, Stoney Sept proved something more important than survival. Robert could be wounded, isolated, and hunted, and ordinary people would still risk death to hide him. The rebellion had gained a hero. Now it needed a political foundation. Hoster Tully offered the strength of the Riverlands, but alliances in Westeros were sealed with marriage. Brandon Stark had been promised to Hoster's elder daughter, Catelyn. Brandon was dead. Ned inherited not only Winterfell, but Brandon's place at the altar. At River Run, Ned married a woman who had expected to become his brother's wife. Jon Arryn, aging and without an heir, married Catelyn's younger sister, Lysa. These were not the romantic unions singers celebrate. They were emergency architecture. Aerys had tried to isolate and destroy great houses one at a time. Marriage now bound the North, the Vale, the Riverlands, and the Stormlands into a structure his crown could not easily break. While vows were spoken at River Run, tension tightened around Storm's End. The siege lasted most of a year. Stannis's men ate the horses, then dogs and cats, then rats. Across the lines, the Reach Lords held banquets where the smell of roasted food drifted toward the castle walls. Stannis refused to yield. His stubbornness is sometimes treated as a joke, but here it became a weapon. If Storm's End fell, Robert would lose his ancestral seat. His brothers could become hostages. Tension and the Tyrell host would be free to join the main royal army. By remaining behind the walls, Stannis fixed one of the largest forces in Westeros in place. Then, one night, a smuggler sailed through the Redwyne blockade. His name was Davos. His ship carried onions and salted fish. Not enough to end the siege, but enough to keep the garrison alive and prove that the blockade was not perfect. No dragon returned to House Targaryen during the rebellion. An onion saved House Baratheon. After the Battle of the Bells, Aerys finally understood that his dynasty might fall. He ordered the alchemists of King's Landing to begin hiding wildfire beneath the city, under gates, streets, houses, and places crowded with his own people. At the same time, the king sent Lord Commander Gerald Hightower to find Rhaegar. The prince had been absent through the opening phase of the war his disappearance had helped ignite. Now, at last, Rhaegar returned from the south. He gathered the loyalist armies and prepared to meet Robert at the Trident. Before leaving King's Landing, he spoke privately with the young Kingsguard knight Jaime Lannister. Rhaegar suggested that after the battle, he intended to call a council and make long-delayed changes. It was a promise of the king he might have become. Jaime never saw him again. The Trident is not one river, but three great forks spreading across the Riverlands. To reach King's Landing, the rebels had to move south. To stop them, Rhaegar led the royal army north and prepared to cross at a ford. The prince brought roughly 40,000 men. 10,000 had come from Dorne, commanded by Prince Lewin Martell of the Kingsguard. Dorne did not march out of love for Aerys. The king had kept Lewin's niece Elia and her children in the Red Keep, a royal family treated like hostages by its own crown. The rebel army was smaller, but it had survived Gulltown, Summerhall, Ashford, and Stoney Sept. Its commanders had learned to trust one another. Its soldiers knew that defeat would not mean a negotiated peace. Aerys had already shown them what his justice looked like. At the ford, thousands entered the water. Imagine the sound before you imagine the sight. Horns, horses screaming, shields striking shields, officers shouting orders no one could hear. The river pulled at men in armor while arrows fell among them. Every step across the current demanded balance, strength, and luck. On one side fought the last great host of the Dragon Dynasty. On the other fought an alliance that had begun with one old man refusing to murder his foster sons. The battle spread along the banks. Prince Lewin was wounded and killed. Barristan Selmy fought until his body carried wounds from sword, spear, and arrow. Robert would later spare him, recognizing courage even beneath an enemy banner. And somewhere in the chaos, Robert found Rhaegar. The two men have become symbols so powerful that it is difficult to see the human beings inside them. Robert was the warrior in his natural element, massive in black armor, antlered helm above the crowd, wielding a warhammer so heavy that few men could use it in battle. Rhaegar wore black plate set with rubies. He was an accomplished knight, but his greatest reputation came from what others believed he might become. Behind him stood the old dynasty, prophecy, and the possibility of reform. Behind Robert stood outrage, momentum, and a future no one had fully planned. They fought in the river while armies collided around them. Rhaegar wounded Robert. The prince did not fall easily or helplessly, but Robert stayed on his feet, found his opening, and swung the hammer into Rhaegar's chest. The rubies on the prince's armor burst free and scattered through the water. Rhaegar Targaryen fell. For soldiers close enough to see it, the meaning was immediate. The heir to the Iron Throne was dead. The royal line had lost its commander, its hope, and the one man who might have replaced Aerys without destroying the institution around him. The loyalist army broke. Men from both sides later searched the ford for Rhaegar's rubies. The crossing would be remembered as the Ruby Ford. Even years afterward, stones from his armor were said to wash up along the quiet isle, fragments of a future that never arrived. This was Robert's greatest victory, and perhaps the last day on which he was perfectly suited to the role history gave him. He knew how to win a battlefield. He knew how to inspire exhausted men. He knew how to forgive brave enemies and make them love him. But ruling requires attention after the cheering stops. Robert was wounded and could not lead the pursuit. Ned Stark rode south in his place. The rebellion had been fought in Robert's name, and around this time he made clear that he would claim the Iron Throne. The Maesters could defend that choice through his grandmother, Rhaegar Targaryen, but blood was only the legal decoration. Robert's hammer had made the real argument. King's Landing now lay ahead, and Tywin Lannister was finally moving. Long before the rebel army reached the capital, Aerys had his final answer. The pyromancers placed jars of wildfire beneath King's Landing, beneath the city gates, beneath streets and buildings near the Red Keep, and in locations where flame could spread faster than any bucket line could stop it. Wildfire is not ordinary flame. It clings, spreads, and burns with a green fury capable of consuming stone, flesh, and timber together. Hidden across a crowded city, the caches turned King's Landing into a weapon pointed at itself. The king's hand, Carlton Chelstead discovered the plot and tried to stop it. When Aerys refused, Chelstead resigned his office. Aerys burned him alive and gave the chain of office to Rosart, his favorite pyromancer. After the Trident, Queen Rhaella and the young Prince Viserys were sent to Dragonstone. Aerys forced Elia Martell and Rhaegar's children to remain in the city. They were insurance against Dorne, and perhaps punishment for the son whose popularity he had always feared. Then, 12,000 Lannister soldiers appeared outside the gates. Tywin had ignored appeals from both sides for most of the war. His delay was not confusion. It was strategy. By waiting, he preserved his army and made his choice at the moment it would carry maximum value. He claimed he had come to defend the king. Varys warned Aerys not to trust him. Grand Maester Pycelle argued that Tywin was an old ally and should be admitted. Aerys opened the gates. The Lannister army entered in friendship and began the sack. Order collapsed almost immediately. Soldiers looted homes, killed residents, and tore through the city while the forces still loyal to Aerys tried to understand what had happened. Inside the Red Keep, the king saw betrayal become real. He commanded Rosart to ignite the wildfire. He ordered Jaime Lannister, the only Kingsguard knight still with him, to kill Tywin and bring back his father's head. Jaime was 17 years old. Every story he had ever heard said his duty was simple: protect the king, obey the king, die for the king if necessary. But no song had explained what to do when obedience meant the deaths of everyone in the city. Jaime found Rosart first and killed him before the pyromancer could carry out the command. Then he understood that Aerys could send another messenger to another alchemist. Saving the city required more than stopping one man. Jaime returned to the throne room. Aerys fled from him. The young knight caught the king beneath the Iron Throne and killed him. The last Targaryen king died at the foot of the chair his ancestor had forged from conquest. No rebel lord struck the final blow. No righteous challenger announced judgment before the court. The dynasty ended in a nearly empty room, at the hands of a boy wearing its white cloak. When Lannister soldiers entered, they found Jaime above the body. He later sat on the Iron Throne and waited. Ned Stark arrived soon afterward. What Ned saw appeared to confirm the ugliest interpretation. A Lannister knight had murdered the king he swore to guard, then seated himself on that king's throne while his father's soldiers looted the city. Jaime did not explain the wildfire. Pride, shock, and contempt sealed his mouth. Ned did not ask. One had saved the city and looked dishonorable. Another worshipped honor and judged the act without knowing whom it had saved. That misunderstanding would poison their relationship for years. Elsewhere in the Red Keep, the sack became even darker. Tywin's men killed Elia Martell and both of Rhaegar's young children, Rhaenys and Aegon. The details are brutal, but their political purpose was brutally clear. Dead children could not grow into claimants around whom Targaryen loyalists might gather. Tywin presented the bodies when Robert reached the city. Robert accepted the killings as a necessity of war. Ned called them murder. Here, the moral alliance at the center of the rebellion cracked. Ned had fought because Aerys murdered innocents and called it justice. victory could not make the same act acceptable merely because the victims wore a different name. Robert saw dead enemies and a safer throne. Ned saw children. They argued, and Ned rode south in anger to finish the war without him. King's Landing had fallen. Aerys was dead. Rhaegar was dead. The dragon banners had come down, but Lyanna was still missing. Ned first rode to Storm's End. The Tyrell host had remained outside the castle while the decisive battles were fought elsewhere. When Ned arrived with news that the dynasty had fallen, the Lords of the Reach lowered their banners. Stannis and his starving garrison survived. There was no celebration for Ned. He continued south with 6 companions: Howland Reed, Willem Dustin, Ethan Glover, Martin Cassell, Theo Wool, and Mark Risewell. In the Red Mountains of Dorne, they found a lonely tower and 3 white-cloaked knights. Sir Gerald Hightower was Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Sir Oswell Went belonged to the family that had hosted the fateful tourney at Harrenhal. Sir Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning, was considered by many the finest knight of his age. His pale greatsword, Dawn, was famous across the realm. Their presence asked a question before Ned said a word. Why were 3 of the greatest royal guards alive at an isolated tower while the king, the prince, and the prince's children died without them? Ned reminded them that the war was over. The Kingsguard answered that they did not flee and did not abandon the duty given to them. The meaning of that duty was inside the tower. 7 drew steel against 3. The details survive only through Ned's fevered memories. When the fight ended, Arthur Dane and his brothers were dead. 5 of Ned's companions had fallen. Howland Reed had saved Ned in some manner never fully explained. Only the 2 of them entered the tower. Ned found Lyanna dying in a bed of blood, the scent of blue roses around her. She was 16 years old. She made him promise something. The published novels have not yet stated the words of that promise or directly named the child connected to it. But the evidence overwhelmingly points to the secret at the heart of the entire saga. Jon Snow was not Ned Stark's bastard. He was the son of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen. The television adaptation confirms that parentage and adds that Rhaegar and Lyanna married after an annulment, making Jon legitimate with the name Aegon Targaryen. Those details, his name, the annulment, and his legal status, remain unconfirmed in the published books. What matters to Ned in either version is simpler. Robert had accepted the deaths of Rhaegar's other children. If he learned that Lyanna had given birth to Rhaegar's son, he might see another dragon spawn and another threat to his crown. So Ned made the most honorable choice available to him by committing the most painful lie of his life. He claimed the child as his own bastard. He allowed Robert to believe Rhaegar had left no son at the tower. He allowed Catelyn to believe her new husband had returned from war carrying proof of infidelity. He allowed the North to whisper about the one public stain on Eddard Stark's honor. Every judgment protected the boy. Ned returned to Winterfell with Jon Snow. He brought Lyanna's bones home to the crypts. Robert took the throne he had won for a woman who was already dead, never knowing that her final wish had placed Rhaegar's blood beneath Ned's roof. The rebellion was over. Its consequences had only begun. Robert Baratheon was crowned king. Jon Arryn became his hand. Barristan Selmy was pardoned and returned to the Kingsguard. Jaime Lannister kept his white cloak, though the realm gave him a new name, the Kingslayer, without ever learning why the city still stood. Robert married Cersei Lannister, binding the new dynasty to Tywin's wealth and power. On their wedding night, Robert reportedly spoke Lyanna's name. The marriage began with a ghost between them and would help create the next civil war. Dorne did not forget Elia or her children. The Martells buried their anger beneath apparent peace and planned for a future reckoning. On Dragonstone, Queen Rhaella crowned Viserys before dying while giving birth to Daenerys during a terrible storm. Sir Willem Darry carried the two children across the narrow sea before Robert's forces could take them. The last visible heirs of House Targaryen grew up in exile. And at Winterfell, a boy named Jon Snow grew up believing he was the shame of the most honorable man in Westeros. This is why Robert's rebellion is not merely backstory. Every major conflict in Game of Thrones grows from its unfinished business. Jaime's reputation, Cersei's marriage, Daenerys' exile, the rage of Dorne, Stannis' resentment, Jon Connington's failure, the wildfire beneath King's Landing, Robert's hatred, Ned's promise, Jon's identity. Robert won the war, but victory did not reveal the truth. It buried the truth beneath a crown. Was Rhaegar a kidnapper, a lover, or a man so convinced of prophecy that he stopped seeing the lives it would destroy? Did Lyanna choose him freely? Or did a choice become a prison when war began? Would Rhaegar have removed his father and become the king the realm needed? Or had his decisions already proved that he valued destiny above duty? The story refuses to give us easy answers because easy answers belong to songs, not history. The singers say Robert fought for love. The maesters say he fought for a throne. The rebels said they fought against a tyrant. All of them are partly right. But the dynasty truly fell because one by one, the people holding it together were forced to choose between loyalty and conscience. Jon Arryn chose his foster sons. Tywin chose his legacy. Jaime chose the city. Ned chose a child. And Robert chose the hammer. Nearly 300 years of fire and blood ended in less than 1 year. The dragon died in the river. The stag sat on the throne. And far to the north, hidden under the name Snow, the last secret of the rebellion waited for winter to return. If you want the next chapter in this history, the story does not continue with Robert. It continues with the exiles, survivors, and secrets he left behind. Subscribe, and in the next video we will follow the complete fall of the Mad King, from the promise of his early reign to the wildfire buried beneath King's Landing.